Oh, it's Notre Dame stuff.
Former federal prosecutor, how would you close this case out if you were making the
Good morning, everyone. Craig, is everyone in? Okay, good morning.
Good morning.
Hopefully everybody can hear me. We'd ask that you just keep your microphone muted at the moment, just to try to eliminate some background noise. Welcome to the first public meeting as part of the Stewart Lake Causation Study consultation process. Thanks so much for joining us virtually today. We appreciate your willingness to participate in the electronic format of this meeting, and hopefully there are some silver linings. Maybe some of you were able to join today who may not have been able to join in person. My name is Jackie Evans. I'm the Planning, Policy, and Programs Coordinator at the district. I just wanted to mention before we get too far into the meeting that it is being recorded and it will be made available for viewing on the Stewart Lake project page on our Engage Muskoka website after the meeting. So given this, if you're not comfortable participating, feel free to keep your camera and microphone off and just continue to watch and listen and follow up with me after the meeting with your input or comments. So causation studies are initiated in accordance with the Muskoka official plan when a lake experiences one of three water quality indicators, one being the occurrence of a blue-green algae bloom. Stewart Lake was chosen for this study based on its history of algae blooms in 2010 and 2011, and the lake subsequently experienced another bloom in fall of 2020. But there are many other lakes that have experienced blooms. Stewart Lake was also chosen based on the fact that the Lake Association has been highly engaged and have invested considerable resources in a variety of water quality initiatives to date. Also of importance is that the lake has higher development potential, is located in two different municipalities with the potential to impact a wide variety of stakeholders, and is also the location of a municipal source water intake, which supplies drinking water to residents of MacTier. There are 4 other causation studies happening concurrently with the Stewart Lake study, and while studies will be unique to each lake, we also have an opportunity to look at factors affecting water quality across the watershed. For each causation study, a consulting team was selected, which includes individuals with expertise in public engagement and in lake science. Together, this team will be studying Stewart Lake and liaising with stakeholders to assist in determining why algae blooms have been occurring. Our project team is looking forward to the upcoming work on this study, and we look forward to hearing from all of you. Craig, would you please go to the first slide? Thank you. I'd like to take a few minutes to introduce the other members of the project team. Dr. Christopher Hadley, PhD of Hutchinson Environmental Sciences, has 15 years of experience as an aquatic scientist and 7 years as an environmental consultant. His PhD included research on over 50 lakes in the Muskoka-Haliburton region to assess the impact of recent stressors, including climate and land use change. As a consultant, Chris has worked on water quality issues across Canada, including extensive experience assessing the trophic status of lakes and managing water quality issues, including cyanobacterial blooms. His recent consulting experience includes a review of the factors controlling cyanobacterial blooms in Chamcook Lake, New Brunswick with Dr. Alan Curry, and the development and application of a framework for causation studies for the District of Muskoka as part of the Peninsula Lake Causation Study Pilot Program. Francis Wilbur is a planner with EcoView Consulting based out of Peterborough. With over 20 years of experience, Francis has worked on a number of both large and small scale consultation projects. Francis has experience working in both the private and nonprofit sectors, including contracts with the Federation of Ontario Cottagers Associations. Jessica Ray Reed is a junior planner with EcoView Consulting. Jessica has experience working with both municipal and private sector clients. She has experience assisting with public open houses and has worked extensively on community engagement related to official plan and zoning bylaw amendments. Colleagues of mine at the district who will be involved in the study and who are on the call today include Summer Valentine, Director of Planning, Stewart Hurd, Area Manager of Water and Wastewater Operations over in the MacTier area, and Rebecca Willison, Watershed Planning Technician. We also have Craig Little online today, helping us with administration and making sure our technology runs as smoothly as possible. Last but certainly not least, we will be relying on the participation of stakeholders such as yourselves, members of the Lake Association, those who live or work on or near the lakes, those who use the lake for recreational purposes, and others who have important knowledge that is vital to our current and historical understanding of the lake. We also appreciate participation of our area municipal colleagues, including Bryce Sharp, the manager of planning at Muskoka Lakes, and Victoria Lemieux, the manager of planning at Georgian Bay, as well as Councillor Wianco of the Township of Georgian Bay. Next slide, please, Craig. In terms of project roles, I will be the point of contact for you and other members of the public who need information about the study or who are looking to contribute data or other information. We'll share a slide with contact information at the end of the presentation, but after today, if you have any additional information you'd like to share or any questions that weren't answered, I'd invite you to contact me directly and I'll be sure to pass along your inquiry or input to the appropriate project team member. Francis Wilbur from EcoView will be leading the consultation activities related to the study, including today's meeting, and Chris Hadley from Hutchinson Environmental Sciences will be leading the scientific process and technical aspects of the study. Thank you again, everyone, for joining today, and with that, I'll turn it over to Francis.
Thank you very much, Jackie, and welcome everybody. Craig, could we move on to the next slide? Welcome everybody to the meeting, and I just wanted to go over some housekeeping as we're using the virtual Zoom platform for this meeting. Sometimes it works, and we just want to go over some of the housekeeping stuff. So what we're going to be doing is monitoring the chat function throughout the presentation. So if you did have a question, we're going to keep people muted throughout the presentation, but if you do have a question, please feel free to post that question in the chat function, and we will be monitoring that throughout. Like I said, everybody will be muted, and that at the end of the presentation, we will be doing a question and answer period, at which point we will unmute people to ask those questions. If you don't have a chance to share with the project team during this meeting, or if you're not comfortable using this format, we will be available following this presentation. And as Jackie has said, we will be providing everybody with contact details following the presentation. And I just wanted to say that there are some challenges with virtual presentations, and if there is something that doesn't work, we apologize profusely and we will try and sort it out. We've got lots of support on the line to try and sort those out. If you did have a technical question, we're asking you to directly let Craig Little know through the chat function. You can do a direct chat to him and hopefully he can help sort it out. If not, like I said, following the presentation, we'd be available to follow up on any questions that come up. And we're asking everybody to be a bit patient during this process. This is, we've been at this almost a year now, but sometimes there are some challenges that do happen. So please be patient with us as we work through this presentation using Zoom. Next slide. Okay, so Craig was going to run a poll for us. Craig, can I ask you to do that? And we're just asking everybody if they could please let us know what your connection is to Stewart Lake and why you're on this meeting. So we've got a couple options here. So year-round resident on Stewart Lake, a seasonal resident on Stewart Lake, owner of a business located on Stewart Lake, or if you're just here for interest's sake and you just wanted to find out about the presentation and the project, then we've got an option for you there. So it looks like right now, most of the people on the call, interestingly, don't live or work on Stewart Lake, but have an interest in the project. So, and we'll just leave it open for another maybe couple of seconds here. Looks like we've got 15 people that voted, seasonal residents, couple year-round residents, and 1 or 2 people. Looks like 7 people that are interested in the project but don't live or work on Stewart Lake. Okay, maybe we can end the polling with that. So most of the people involved in this call don't live or work on Stewart Lake, but we're happy to have you and to hear what you have to say. So maybe we can close the poll, Craig? Oh, and I see Richard is a year-round resident on the lake, which was, I think we did have that option, but that's fine.
Yes.
We've got lots of time to go through that. So, and then Craig, could we go to the next slide? So in terms of today's presentation, we wanted to first do the presentation. Both EcoView and Hutchison will be sharing this presentation, as Jackie has said. So we'll be providing some background on the causation studies. We'll talk specifically about the Stewart Lake study and about the next steps. We will finish a presentation with a question and answer period from everybody. And most importantly, we do want to hear from you during this presentation and following the presentation. There's lots of opportunity to share data and to share your questions today and following as the study progresses. If you, like I said, if you don't get a chance to share that with the presentation today, there is a survey that we are launching probably mid-week where we will be asking specific questions about Stewart Lake, and that will be another opportunity to share your information, and will also be available through Engage Muskoka. We will have that information at the end of the presentation. Craig, do you want to go to the next one? Okay, so we were going to start with what is a causation study. So Jackie did go through this a little bit at the beginning, but I wanted to be a bit more specific about what a causation study is. So as Jackie said, in the official plan for the District of Muskoka does outline policies on how land use can be used in your community. An official plan is important to help your community ensure that future planning and development meet the specific needs of your community. The District of Muskoka describes causation studies, which help to determine a lake's vulnerability and therefore help the district inform planning policy and program changes for your lake and watershed as a whole. Now, a causation study is for this, I just want to go over that each lake is different, but that a watershed approach is important when we're thinking of causation studies. The concurrent studies will lead to broader conclusions and recommendations that will be applied at a watershed-wide basis. So a causation study will inform future policy and program changes throughout the district. Can you go to the next one, Craig? The steps of a causation study are outlined in the official plan for the District of Muskoka. And I want to say that I understand there'll be some people on this call that this isn't new information for, but we do want to go through this process and let you know exactly what a causation study is for the people that are new to the process, because we do want to involve everybody in the causation study who has an interest in the lake. And in order to do that, we want to make sure that people really understand what the causation study is and what a causation study isn't. So the causation study, the process is outlined in the official plan for the District of Muskoka. And although each lake will be different, we are following a process. And Chris will take you through the process specifically for Stewart Lake. But I just wanted to let you know that this process is one that is outlined throughout the official plan. And we follow this process for all of the causation studies that are happening at the same time. So we will be assessing the existing water quality conditions on your lake. We'll be looking at historic water quality and or algae abundances on the lake, model and quantify the sources of nutrients, and determine if water quality is deteriorating or if algae compositions communities are changing. And we will be attributing specific causes and contributing factors to the water quality indicators. And we'll go through towards the end of this presentation on what kind of things you might expect, recommendations, conclusions from a causation study. We're still at the very preliminary stages of the presentation of the project, but we can go over, you know, what kind of things we might expect from a causation study. Next slide. And with this, I'm going to let Chris take over here and talk through the specifics of the project on Stewart Lake. Chris?
Thank you. So listing the lake under the official plan is done under 3 criteria. Those criteria are listed here. So high long-term phosphorus levels, high being over 20 micrograms per liter, an increasing trend in phosphorus levels over time, or a confirmed cyanobacterial bloom. In the case of Stewart Lake, it's number 3 that triggered the causation study. The phosphorus levels in Stewart Lake are not particularly high. In terms of why these 3 factors are important, from a management perspective, phosphorus levels are the most controllable source of nutrients, and they are also the limiting source of nutrients in the vast majority of lakes in Ontario. There are exceptions to that rule where phosphorus isn't the limiting nutrient, but and nitrogen is, but that's not the case here. And then, so that's why nutrients are important and why we look at phosphorus in particular. It controls the growth of many forms of algae. And then obviously why blue-green algal blooms, or cyanobacterial blooms, as you might call them, are a factor is because they are both a nuisance and in terms of aesthetics, and also, depending on the species that you're talking about, can be toxic and harmful to animals and to humans. So vulnerable lakes, those listed under Schedule E of the official plan, are subject to causation studies, and beginning with Peninsula Lake in 2019 and 2020, in a time when we were all still allowed to go outside, we developed a framework in order to try and address those. So can I get the next slide, please, Craig? Thank you. So the pilot program on Peninsula Lake began with myself and Neil Hutchinson developing a framework for what we called a weight of evidence approach in order to try and determine what the key factors leading to the cyanobacterial blooms on those lakes were. So by a weight of evidence approach, I'll go over the framework in a minute, but essentially what we wanted to do is look at as many lines of evidence as we could with the data on the lake that are available. So that can be water quality data, that can be climate data in the area, that can be historical information from stakeholders on cyanobacterial blooms in the area, or things that have been observed on the lake, and put all those things together into basically into a framework that says, well, which one of these things are happening, or what's happening on the lake, and what does that tell us about what might be causing algal blooms? Obviously, we don't have active water quality sampling at the time of a bloom every single time a bloom occurs, which would be ideal, but is not realistic. So we have to rely on long-term data and observational information and try and put that information together in a meaningful way. Next slide. So this is the weight of evidence approach. I'm not going to belabor this slide too much, but essentially at the top is the blue, green, and orange climate, water chemistry, and algal bloom history. We want to look at when the algal blooms have been occurring, excuse me, how frequently they've been occurring, their magnitude, what types of species. So all that information is important. Nutrients, general chemistries, toxins, any water chemistry data we have available feeds into another line of evidence. And then we want to look at air temperature, precipitation, solar radiation, anything climate-based that could control properties of the lake that may cause blooms. And essentially all those feed into our analysis, looking at changes over time and what we call step changes, which would be, instead of a gradual change over time, a large change all at once that co-occurs with a bloom. So if you have a bloom occurring, for example, at the exact same time as you have a huge spike in phosphorus, that might tell you something. So I'll just go on to the next slide at this point and get into the causation study on Stewart specifics. So what we'll be doing is reviewing all of the water quality monitoring data that we have. The district has been monitoring the lake for quite some time. I'll do a little bit of background information on some of that on the next slide. I saw a comment in the chat from the Stewart Lake Association on storm sewers. We don't have anybody on the call from storm sewers today. We do have Stewart Hurd from the treatment plant, so he can speak to any treatment plant questions later. Storm sewers, we will be addressing storm sewers, but I don't have anybody to give you specific answers on storm sewers, but they will be considered. I believe the question will they be considered. The answer is yes, as far as I know, they will be considered. Anything that goes into the lake is going to be considered that we have data on. So the answer is yes. And then we'll be assessing based on the current information that we have available if there's any need for additional sampling on the lake as part of the causation study or as part of follow-up studies to the causation study. So the example that's given here is septic inspection. So if there's an indication that septics are a concern, septics can't be incorporated into the causation study because it's not, that's a long-term project on its own that requires gathering a lot of data, but a recommendation coming out of the study could be to do some additional work of that sort. And then we're also going to be considering contributions from stakeholders, and later on in the presentation, Francis is going to highlight exactly what kind of information and how best to get it to us. Next slide, please. So the current conditions or long-term conditions of Stewart Lake, just a very brief overview. The phosphorus levels are not particularly high. The long-term average phosphorus concentrations is just under 6 micrograms per liter, which is not considered, which is considered oligotrophic. The blooms on Stewart Lake are very similar to what we saw in Peninsula Lake. Anabina has been the most recent bloom, the one that happened last year. Gliotrichia has bloomed in the past on Stewart Lake based on my preliminary scan of the some of the historical reporting that's been done. The MNR classifies development on Stewart Lake as being intense overall, so that would be overall shoreline development. So a large percentage of the shoreline is developed, but the individual lot development is actually considered to be fairly good. So it's recommended for the health of a lake that 75% of the shoreline of a property remains natural, leaving 25% for development. And the average shoreline development on Stewart Lake, based on the 2017 district survey, was about 27%. So that's pretty good. Dissolved oxygen doesn't appear to be a problem. So dissolved oxygen dipping down to extreme low levels in a lake can release phosphorus from sediments, but the oxygen based on sampling that the district has done most recently does not seem to be a problem. We will, however, be following up with our own sampling this fall to sort of confirm that, because internal loading of phosphorus from sediments can be so important to these lakes. We want to, that's part of the sampling that we put into the original program. Next slide, please. So the wastewater treatment plant draws water. Unfortunately, the sampling location is not located on here, but the sampling, the long-term monitoring location from Stewart Lake is in that eastern basin, right center in that eastern basin. So some of the interesting possibilities as I review the data that might warrant additional sampling on the lake. There's not a lot of significant inflow. The inflow to the lake is from a fairly small watershed. It's largely overland flow. There's a wetland to the south that has a little bit of what looks like channelized flow that might come in. The outflow is regulated by the MNR or by an MNR structure, but I don't believe that it's actively regulated. So that goes out to the north and then into Lake Joseph. Water quality in the northeastern arm of the lake right there. I don't know if there's any data on that yet. I haven't gone through all of the data yet, but it will be interesting to see, because the behavior of a bay like that could be different than the lake and might be interesting depending on its depth. So that's just a couple of things that I'll be looking at going into the study that sort of caught my eye. And then on the next slide, we have what I was referring to earlier. And like I said, Stewart can talk to this during the question period at the end, but there is a intake on the lake and then an outfall from the lake. And there are samples being collected by the various water and wastewater treatment plants. And so that we will be looking at those. Again, going back to the storm sewer side of things, we don't have anybody on the call for that, but direct those questions to Jackie and we'll get answers to them as soon as we can. Next slide. So in terms of, I guess I already covered this a little bit earlier, I got ahead of myself, but in terms of what might cause an algal bloom on a lake, that loss of deep water oxygen is one of the things that we're really concerned about, particularly with what we've been seeing across Muskoka in the last little while. Everybody, I think, has probably observed that we're getting a lot longer summers. Ice is coming off this year, really highlights it. I think in a lot of places, the ice has come off very early this year. That gives a lot more time for stratification in lakes to set up. So that is basically when the surface of the lake gets warm, it creates a barrier to mixing, and that results in what you see in that top right graph, which is the blue line going to zero. So that's the dissolved oxygen in the water going to zero. And when that happens, because of chemical processes between the sediment and bacteria and oxygen, you can get a large amount of phosphorus release from the sediment, and that can feed the algae, which can result in blooms. So that's one of the things that we want to focus our efforts on, but by no means is it the only thing. We're obviously going to be looking at all of the data that we have available, but you can see the bottom right graph. As soon as that oxygen goes to zero, you see the red line spike in the bottom right graph, and that's phosphorus coming out of the sediments. This is not from Stewart Lake. This is data from Sturgeon Bay, just as an example. But and then the bottom left, you see the teal line going up starting in June, and that's cyanobacteria. So you start feeding the algae and they can grow. Next slide, please. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Frances, and she will go over some of the expectations from the causation study and how you guys can best contribute information and observations to the causation study. And if anybody has any questions for me, I'll be happy to answer anything that you have after the presentation is over. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And as Chris said, he'll be around for questions after the presentation. So we will be unmuting everybody at that point. So if you've got questions, keep them until the end or put them in chat and we can try and answer them throughout. So what can you expect from this causation study? We'll be reviewing all the scientific data, as Chris has just said. So they'll be collecting that into the fall and reviewing all of the background information as well that's already taken place on the lake. We will, you can expect to have defensible conclusions and recommendations. As you saw before, I showed you the process that we go through for a causation study. And so that process gets us to conclusions and recommendations that are defensible. There will be a report that goes through the whole process, and recommendations will be included in that. Change is future forward. So what we mean by this is that we all have a role in this causation study and we're all part of the process. And we will be looking at what the causation study can do going forward. So we're not looking necessarily about what's happened in the past, but what we can do in the future. And we just want to make clear again that what a causation study is not. So we're not doing an original research project, and we're not doing a site-by-site review of development on the lake. We're looking at scientific data through a process with recommendations at the end. So there'll be unanswered questions at the end of this. It's not an all-encompassing study, but we do go through this process to develop recommendations, and some of those recommendations will most likely be to do further studying in certain areas, depending on what the scientific data shows us at the end. Next slide, Craig. So like I said, in the part of the causation study will be a number of conclusions, and those conclusions will be specific not only to Stewart Lake, but also to the entire watershed. So this causation study is one that's going on. We're doing 5 at the time, and I'm sure the district will be doing more in the future. And each causation study will have specific recommendations for each citizen, for the district, and for the wider community. And those recommendations will be both specific to Stewart Lake and to the watershed as a whole. So when we say the conclusions and the recommendations will be outlined in the final report, and they will be at different levels. And like I said, some of the recommendations might be to do more studying in certain areas. And we'll be sharing the information that we have between the 5 causation studies that are ongoing. Next slide. So I just wanted to go over the progress today. And this Stewart Lake, we've been involved for a while now because we had started the original one, and then the district reissued an RFP, and it was obviously awarded to both Chris's Hutchison and EcoView. And so we're working together on this project. We have had a startup meeting with the district and Hutchison EcoView to go over the project. We've had a lot of information already shared from the district, and we've developed the consultation process. We are, this is the first meeting that's taken place with stakeholders, and I'll go through the next couple slides where I show you the process to get to the end. But right now we're looking at receiving data, reviewing the data, identifying past studies and existing data that already exist, and identifying initial gaps in data. So we do have some of the information that has already taken place on Stewart Lake, and this meeting is going to help us establish and get any other information that is out there. Can you go to the next slide, please, Craig? So like I said, today is the first public meeting. We're also launching a survey where we're asking specific questions about Stewart Lake and about details that you and the details or information that you have about Stewart Lake. That will be launched in the next couple of days. So Chris and his team will be gathering data and analysis over the spring, summer, and fall of 2021. We will plan for a second public meeting in the fall of 2021. And at that second public meeting, you can expect to have some recommendations as part, based on all of the work that we've done up until that point. There will be a draft report available in early 2022. And that final report, we expect to have out in mid-2022. And at that point, we will be presenting the final report to the District Community and Planning Services Committee. And that report, like I said, will include a number of recommendations. Next slide. So how can you help in terms of stakeholder engagement? We really need your knowledge of the lake. We need to understand the data that you have and to incorporate that into the work that Chris is doing. So the terms of reference for the project are going to incorporate the feedback that we get today and through the length of the project. So specifically, we're looking for any data that you have on historical weather patterns on the lake, some related to algae blooms and not necessarily. Sometimes people keep, when the ice was out for the last however many years. Any of that kind of information will be very helpful for the project team. Any water quality sampling data or lake-specific studies. Now, some of that has already been shared, and at the end of the presentation, if you had specific questions about what has been shared with the project team already, we can answer that. We also are looking for information on point source of nutrients, if you happen to know of anything, historic observations on water quality changes, observations on weather patterns, lake plans, and any photos that you have of algae blooms on the lake. And that can be shared through the survey or just by contacting Jackie through Engage Muskoka. So you want to go back to the, to the next slide, Craig. So we're going to, like I said, launch the survey, which will have the opportunity to share a lot of data at that point. We're asking that you contact the district directly to submit any data that you have that the project team doesn't already have. So the next slide, I'm going to give you Jackie's email address, but the district, all of the information will go through Jackie, who will then share that with the project team. And we're asking if you can continue to monitor this summer and send any data that you observe this summer. That will all be included in the causation study. And to visit Engage Muskoka regularly and subscribe for project updates that way. So thank you for going to the next slide. So we've got Engage Muskoka. And I think, Jackie, you're going to talk about the best way to contact. Craig, could you go back up to the how to stay in touch? And I think Jackie was just going to let us know.
Thanks, Francis. Yeah, certainly. To stay in touch with me, you have my email there. My extension at the district is 4114, but email would be the best way to contact me, and I'll make sure that any information or comments or data that you wish to share would be distributed to the appropriate consultant. You can also visit our Engage Muskoka page. So you'd want to go to engagemuskoka.ca. Click on the project that says Protecting Muskoka's Vulnerable Lakes, Causation Studies, scroll down and click on the Stewart Lake Causation Study page. And then in the top right-hand corner, if you haven't done so already, there is an option for you to subscribe to updates. And so we'll be releasing the survey through Engage, as well as the terms of reference that Francis was talking about. All of the kind of milestones throughout the project will be released through the Engage page. And if you subscribe to updates, we send out a little email every time we've launched another part of the project.
Thanks, Jackie. So I think all of the information, everything should go through Jackie, and she will then let the project team know when that information has come in. So I think at this point Craig, could you go down? There's one slide that says questions, and then the next one was the map. We were just going to keep the map up when we started the question and answer period, just for reference sake. So if you wanted to reference the map, that's great. And I think at this point, we can open up to questions. And if you could raise your hand, it's the best way for us to be able to answer those questions is to sort of go through anybody who has their hand raised. So we can start the process like that, if that works for people.
I'm going to jump in and answer the first question on the that just came into the chat. So the question is, you indicated that it's not always possible to collect samples when the blooms are occurring. Is there a role the Lake Association can play in collecting samples? The best thing that the Lake Association can do in terms of samples, if a bloom is actively occurring, is report that bloom to Spills Action. The MECP, there's a phone number for spills. Contaminant spills in water, and an algal bloom, a cyanobacterial bloom, is considered a harmful spill. And if you report it to the MECP, they'll send out an investigator, and that investigator will collect samples following their protocol, send them to an accredited lab to have the algae counted, and if it's warranted, to have toxin samples analyzed as well. And if that bloom is harmful, they will then take steps to let the district know, let us know, and if beaches need to be closed or if anything needs to happen like that, they'll take the appropriate action. So having somebody like that collect samples is the most useful way to get samples to us, because we'll be able to get the information from them. However, pictures, if a bloom is actively occurring on the lake, having pictures of the bloom with an idea of where it is. So the survey that we're circulating is going to have the map that you see here or something similar attached to it. And so if you see a bloom and can indicate where that bloom is occurring, that kind of information is very important, for example. So that's something that the Cottage Association can assist with.
Thank you, Chris. Another question from the chat. How will evaluate the input from the sewage treatment plants that drains into the lake and where the 2020 algae bloom was first located? Is that?
Yeah, so that one as well. So this was I think this was a second part to Victor's question about the storm sewers. So we will be evaluating any data we can get from the storm sewer monitoring. I haven't looked at that data yet, so I don't know specifically what is in that data. But if it's inputting into the lake, my understanding was that the sewage treatment plant does not input directly into the lake. But like I said, we're early stages here, so I haven't got all of the everything connected yet in terms of where everything goes and where everything's located. But yes, anything that's happening at the sewage treatment plant will be considered in my evaluation of the lake, up to and including the amount of data that they're able to give me. So I'll be looking at probably a lot of water chemistry and flow data from the sewage treatment plant to determine what kind of loads might be going into the lake. But I don't know the extent of that data, so I can't get any more specific than that.
Okay. And from Janet, does increased movements of water by motorized vehicles disturb sediment to encourage blooms or heat of the lake midsummer 2019? The water temperature was 86 degrees at my cottage.
Does the increased movement by water and motorized vehicles?
So she's asking about motorized vehicle disturbed sediment, and then also the temperature of the water.
The temperature of the water is very important. The temperature of the water determines the stability of the water column. That's what I was trying to demonstrate with that one slide that I put up on dissolved oxygen. So the temperature of the water is important. The more stable the water column and the longer that the water column is stable for, the lower the oxygen can potentially get deep down in the lake, and that can release phosphorus. Now, the algae that are particularly blooming on Stewart Lake are not water column phosphorus hungry algae. They actually take up a lot of their phosphorus from the sediment directly, which makes them very problematic to manage, which is another thing that we'll be looking at in the report and talking about in the report. But yes, the water temperature is important. The role of motorized vehicles can disturb sediment in shallow waters. Wave action can disturb sediment if you've got hardened shorelines. So we do have some, we have the 2017 survey data from the Stewart Lake Shoreline Assessment, which I'll be looking at, and that will give us some indication as to whether or not there are any shoreline issues that may be disturbing sediment and causing phosphorus loading. But motorized vehicles is not likely going to be something that we're going to be looking at if it looks like it's going to be a relevant issue because of other data on the lake. It could be a recommendation that comes out of the study, but we don't have boating data. So boating data is not something that we're going to be focused on. I'm just going to go up because I believe there's a question that we missed between the one that I answered in that one, and that is what was the level of toxicity in last summer's bloom? I don't have that information yet, but if the bloom was reported and sampled, we'll have that information from the MECP as part of our data request, which we're putting in and gathering all of that data now. So I will be able to answer that question in the study, but I can't answer that question right now. And the samples from Riverstone, as Jackie pointed out, we do have samples because Riverstone, who was initially on the study with Francis, they did sample that bloom. So again, we have that data, but I haven't looked at that specific data.
Okay, and I think, Chris, we've got another question, just follow up to the question before. I think you probably answered this, but does Janet's wakeboards have a particular impact on the waves they generate? Not sure you can answer that or not.
Yeah, I was just saying, I'm not qualified to answer that question.
Yeah, okay.
The specifics of different boats would be something that I would have to research, but in order to look into something like that, we would need not only boating data on the lake, but we would need long-term boating data on the lake to see how that's changed. So something that's important to consider when we're looking at algal blooms and the causes of algal blooms is what we need is data on the algae blooms when they're occurring and where they're occurring, and then data on the lake at those same times and in those same areas, ideally, because that gives us an indication of whether or not there's actual causation between the two. So if you have a large change in boating over time and you have data on that and it coincides with changes in algal blooms, you can make a link between those two things. But without data on boats, there's not a lot I'm going to be able to say about boating activity on the lake.
So if, Victor, I think that was your question, if you wanted to share that information, if you happen to have data on boating on the lake, then we'd be happy to look at it. And if you wanted to put that question also on the survey, we can see what we can do. But without data, it's harder to evaluate that. So I've got another question, Chris. What can a Stewart Lake property owner do on a regular basis to help prevent algae blooms? And I would say part of the answer for that one is going to be that that's what we're figuring out as part of the study, right? There will be recommendations for property owners on Stewart Lake on what they can do, but do you want to add to that?
Absolutely. And I think the 2017 shoreline survey that we'll be reviewing and incorporating into our study did make some recommendations as well, and those will likely be incorporated in some form into our recommendations, or maybe modified into our recommendations. But stewardship activities is something that the district has been encouraging for a long time, and the most direct way a landowner around the lake can impact the lake and the health of the lake is controlling what's leaving your property and entering the lake. So that could be anything from septic systems that are regularly pumped out and maintained to the type of dock that you put into the lake and whether or not it's rooted to the bottom of the lake and potentially disturbing sediment, to I'm trying to think of anything else here. Oh yeah, to the, having a shoreline buffer, for example, on your property, so that if you have lawn, you don't have direct runoff that's running straight into the lake without a chance to absorb into the ground. Because basically those are the sorts of things that you can do as a property owner.
Thank you. And those will be outlined too in the final recommendations as well, right? It's fairly specific for your lake and what you can do, what citizens can do on the lake. I have Paul with his hand up, but first we'll just get Richard's question here. Is the water coming into the lake from the various swamps and fens analyzed at point of input?
That's something that I was looking at this morning briefly, and I don't have a yes or no answer for you yet. There is a number of wetlands surrounding the lake. The one in the south particularly, there appeared to be some channelized flow going through it into Kilty Bay. Whether or not there's any monitoring that's ever been done by anybody there, I don't know for sure yet. It's one of the things that I want to look into to see whether or not we can get input data. There's not a lot of, there are no raging rivers flowing into the lake for obvious inputs, but it looks like mostly overland flow, but there are some possibly ephemeral or only running in the spring channelized flows. Whether or not any of them have been sampled, I don't know. If additional sampling is warranted at those locations, that'll be something that we'll talk to the district about, either as an outcome of the study or if we think we can make it work as potentially an add-on to the study, but that will depend on what's available. So we're early in the early stages of gathering that information, but it is something that I've been looking at.
Okay, so yeah, Richard, we definitely have your question on our minds here. Paul, I think I can unmute you so you can ask your question. Okay, Paul.
No?
There we go.
Yeah, okay. As the district knows, and probably Chris may know too, the township of Georgian Bay has been funding me for, well, over 20 years, but the last 10 years we've been on Stewart Lake doing water quality studies every September. And we sample 4 locations in Stewart Lake. And we do temperature, oxygen profiles from top to bottom, conductivity, Secchi disk, and phosphorus levels at the surface and below the thermoclines. I don't know if you may not have all this data, but I'm just wondering, all this data is summarized in reports that are sent to the township each year, and I say there's like 11 years you've been doing this. And I don't know if you have those reports, but I'm just wondering how much detail you want. The reports just give you a summary of the results, but I do have my data sheets for those 11 years with the oxygen temperature profiles and so on. We also been doing bacteria work, both total coliforms and E. coli and so on. I'm just wondering if bacteria information would be helpful too. So I just don't know how much of this data you want. If you want all the data sheets, you're looking at 50 or 60 pages worth of information and so on. So I'm just trying to find out how much data that you could use.
My question would be, is the data that you're collecting, when you say data sheets, do you have it in spreadsheet format? Because that would be easiest for me to work with. If I'm going to actually.
No, I don't.
No, it's
but
just...
we have Yeah, no, I don't have it in a spreadsheet. That would just be my field sheets. You would have to do a spreadsheet on it. But
Okay.
I say we do have phosphorus values that have been analyzed through, well, originally Queen's University when they were at Dorset, but when they closed up, I had to go to a lab in North Bay. But it's all low-level phosphorus analysis, and I think as you indicated, the average phosphorus levels is about 5.6. My data shows about 7 over the 11 years I've been doing it. So it's just comparable values that you've been receiving, but no, it's not in a spreadsheet. But I just to say, I would have to mail you, 50, 60 pages of data sheets if you really wanted that information, or I can send you, my 11 reports or whatever I have. So I don't know how much data you want.
I would suggest that you start with the reports, send the reports to Jackie, and I'll have a look at the reports. And if we want more information than is available in the reports, that if I need the actual data sheets, if I have use for them, a specific use for them, then I'll get you to send them in as well. And we can sort out how best to get them into an electronic and usable format once you get them to us. But for now, I would start with the data reports. But I definitely want the information, especially if you've got multiple locations on the lake. The district samples one location on the lake in the deep basin. So additional information on the lake is something that I want. I don't want to leave that unconsidered. So yes, please.
What about
send
the bacteria stuff?
The bacteria, I'm not sure that bacteria data is important data to collect from the perspective of the health of the lake, but I'm not sure that it's going to directly feed into the causation of algal blooms. So you can send it along if it's part of the overall historical reports. I'll consider it when I read the reports, but I'm not sure what I would do with bacteria specific data unless we end up needing it for a reason that I'm not foreseeing right now, in which case I can contact you again and we can get it then. But it's great that you're collecting all that information. I think it's going to be very useful.
Sorry, that's all the questions I have in the chat. Is there anybody else who wanted to ask a question?
There's a question here about railway lines.
Oh,
The lake has railway lines running on both
Huh.
the town shore and across the lake. Historically, there was a coal film sitting on the lake as a result of the coal-fired engines. How might this impact the sediment of the lake? It's a difficult question to answer before I get into specifics of the data. But if there's historical impacts and they're registered in the historical data, they'll be considered as the best answer I can give to that. So I don't know that I have any specifics on how the railway has been operating, but if it's impacted the water chemistry of the lake, it should be recorded in the historical data, not just sediment data, but water quality data as well.
okay. So that seems to be all the questions. Does anybody have anything else? Anybody from the district want to say anything or? Oh, I've got Margaret now who's got a question. So I'm going to unmute. Margaret, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
I guess this question is for Chris again. We were on the lake when the algae blooms were reported in 2010, 2011. And at that point in time, we were told that it was Causation. And annually since then, we see the molecules rising in the water column around the first weekend in August, and then it continues. I don't believe anybody at this point in time is reporting those to the Ministry of the Environment and whatever else they are. Is that something we should be doing?
Chris, were you able to hear that question?
I heard 2010, 2011 gliotrichia blooms, and I lost a lot of what happened after there. I apologize. I did not get that question. Can anybody relay that question to me who might have picked it up better than I did?
I wasn't able to hear it either. So Margaret, is there any way you could ask the question again?
Or type it in the chat?
I'll try asking again, and if that doesn't work, we'll try the chat. So since that report was provided in 2010, 2011, there have been annual gliotrichia blooms, and we see the globules rising in the water column starting around the beginning of August, and then we experience these mini blooms where basically the globules rise to the surface and sit there for part of the day, and then the next morning they're gone. I don't believe anybody is reporting those blooms to the Ministry of the Environment at this point in time. Is that something we should be doing?
All right, I got you that time. Thank you for repeating your question. So gliotrichia is a unique beastie that spends its life cycle, its early life cycle in a resting stage in the sediment, and it takes phosphorus up from the sediment and then will eventually leave the sediment into the water column and bloom, for lack of a better term, but in this case, bloom is not the best term. So if every year you're seeing gliotrichia rise from the sediment into the water column for a day and then disappear, the question becomes whether or not that's considered a bloom. So in order for the growth of cyanobacteria, which is something that naturally occurs in all of the lakes in Canada and most of the world, because cyanobacteria has been around for billions of years. In order for that to be a bloom, you have to have basically a certain sort of concentration. So if it's not being reported to the MECP, I wonder whether or not that's because it's localized, or if it's being reported and the MECP is not declaring it a bloom because the concentrations are not high enough. So some growth of cyanobacteria in the late summer and fall is part of what we would call the natural succession of algae over the course of a year. So algae, the kinds of algae that are in your lake are going to change over the year. Early in the year during the spring, when the ice first comes off, you have certain kinds of algae that dominate. And then as the weather gets warmer, that switches to other types of algae. Whether or not it's an actual bloom that's occurring every year, I can't say. If the concentrations are significant enough, then it should be reported to the MECP so that they can determine whether or not what's occurring on the lake is a bloom or not, or if it's just part of sort of the annual growth of algae on the lake. I hope that answers your question.
I'm just going to make sure that Margaret's question has been answered.
Yes, that was that's great, and I think we will. I'm still on the Stewart Lake Association Board of Directors as well, and I think what we will do is encourage our members to report all activity of that nature, and then
I'm sorry, Margaret, you seem to be cutting in and out there. So maybe what we can say is there's going to be opportunity, like through the survey, if you could share that information directly with Chris, that would be great.
Yeah, we lost you. And the other thing I'll say is, as part of the survey, we'll be including some information on sort of spotting an algal bloom, what an algal bloom looks like. And so that might put into context a little bit what you should be looking for on the lake. What is a bloom versus what is just algae happening because algae happens. So
right. So that, yeah, we've got that information on the survey. So hopefully you can share that information there, Margaret. I've got a couple questions in the chat, and I see that Victor also has a question. So the first one in the chat was, will the study consider the impact of future property development cottages on the lake not yet developed? Chris, do you want to?
No, we can't consider as part of this study future development because specifics of future development are unknown. So the study has to be based on defensible science, so data that's been collected and can be analyzed in relation to algal blooms. We can't say what the future will hold for development or for algal blooms, and therefore we can't really incorporate the future into. What we can say is if development pressure has led to changes that we think have caused the algal blooms that are occurring right now, that's one of the outcomes we're obviously looking at, is whether or not development pressure is causing some of these blooms. And if that's the case, then there can be recommendations made on future developments and what to do about future development on the lake. That's something that we would obviously be working with the planning department at the district to determine, but we can't look at future considerations under the scope of the project.
So I think we'll go to Richard now. Sorry, Victor. Sorry, Victor, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, everybody. First of all, thanks, Francis, for taking my question. I think you've answered, I think Chris has answered my two questions with regard to inputs into the lake, the storm sewers and the sewage treatment. We're very interested to find out what impact those are having in terms of phosphate and nitrate levels flowing into the lake. So really, I don't have a question. I really wanted to thank Jackie on behalf of the Stewart Lake Association. She has been a tremendous aid for us in terms of responding to our inquiries and acting as a conduit for Stewart Lake Association. So thank you, Jackie. And I also just wanted to mention to the consultants that Stewart Lake Association represents roughly 70% of the residents on the lake. So we're very much engaged in obviously in the future of our lake, but also very much vested in this study. And anything that the association can do to help the study or provide information, we would be more than happy. So please feel free to reach out to us through Jackie. So thanks again, and we look forward to receiving the results of this study.
Thank you very much, Victor. And we appreciate all the work that the Cottage Association has done and will continue to do throughout the length of the project. So thank you also. And Jackie, yes, all of the information should go through Jackie, and Chris can contact you through Jackie should he need more information from you guys.
Thank you.
There was a question here. Sorry, Chris, did you want to say something?
Oh, I was just going to do exactly what you did. And there's another question in the chat.
Okay, yeah. So the question is around development on the lake and logging activities. And I think Chris has sort of answered that already. But Chris, did you want to take a quick?
Well, actually, what I was going to say is that the current development on the lake is known to us, and that if anybody has any questions relating to the current activity on the lake that they want to ask either as part of the call or offline after the call, I would direct those to Summer at the planning department. She's familiar with the inspections that have been done on those sites, the outcome of those, and can answer any questions. I am aware of the development that's going on the lake, but I am not actively engaged with the development that is going on the lake, obviously. So.
Thank you, Chris. And yes, this is a causation study. So if you did have specific questions about that, then that would be for the district following this call. And with that, I don't know, does anybody else want to raise their hand or put anything in the chat? No? Okay. Jackie, did you want to just finish us off here?
Sure. Thanks, Francis. I just wanted to say thanks so much to Chris and Francis. Thanks for all of my colleagues at the district and at the area municipalities for joining us today. Thank you to Councillor Wienko. We'll certainly be in touch about the data that you have. And thank you to everybody for participating today. And please feel free to get in touch anytime. My email, Francis shared it, but it's also listed on the Engage Muskoka page. So engagemuskoka.ca, and you can find me and this study from there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. And we look forward to working on the project with you.
Thank you, everyone.
That's what we said. It's done.
What did they say? Why did you laugh?
I think it wasn't something we said.
Hello.
Hello.
Is it
Should we
safe?
stop the recording maybe at this point?
Yep,
Yes.
I think that's